Welcome everyone to the 17th edition of the Fenix Infrastructure webinar. Today we have our colleague Björn Hagemeyer from Forschungszentrum Jülich with us, and he will give us a webinar about the Federated Resources Management using FURMS. I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on the Human Brain YouTube channel. And all the attendees, they can do the question and answers by using either the chat function, or they can also use the question and answers option that they have in their Zoom account. Okay, and with any further comments, I'd like to give you now the floor, Björn. So thank you very much for being today with us.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Renata. To introduce today to you today the FURMS, the Fenix User and Resource Management Service, a service that we've been developing over the past, I believe, 4 years by now, as part of the IC project, the which you certainly know by now. So the Interactive Computing E-Infrastructure for the Human Brain, a project building up the Fenix research infrastructure. So I'm going to start with an introduction to what FURMS actually is, the status of development, which has pretty much finished, even though some integration steps still need to be done. A more detailed view on the site local agent, the deployments that we have, and then, of course, something that will be important to you from the point of view of a user, the various roles that users can take on in the FURMS service. So there are various which I'll introduce then later on. There also is a means to access the FURMS service from a command line interface, a command line client that is probably more appropriate for administrator usage. However, I wanted to show you that something like that exists, as well as a RESTful API, which is, of course, the target of the command line client. And then some example workflows of what's going on in the backend, just to give you a better understanding and feeling for the many steps that are actually required in doing federated resource management. So introducing FURMS, like I said, it's an acronym for Fenix User and Resource Management Service. It's intended to be a primary contact point for users as well as administrators in the federated infrastructure to manage resource allocations on a federation level, meaning that you could have projects spanning, so computational or data projects, or projects that in which you collect resources to be used at various sites. And this is the difference to the individual tools that may be available and that you may know at the individual sites, where it's always site specific. Now it becomes federation level and translates whatever happens at the federation level into site specific actions and typically project and resource setups. So FURMS can be used to manage memberships within communities, within projects, manage the resource allocations. And when we talk about HPC resources, even nowadays, they are typically accessed through SSH, such that we allow for SSH key management at the federation level, which means the SSH keys that you register inside FURMS can get or will get forwarded to the individual sites, such that you can almost immediately log in at the sites once you are a registered user within a project that has resources allocated at this site. Policy documents play a role for some sites and some services specifically, where you have to at least acknowledge the existence and your agreement with the policy that goes along with the usage of the site. And we support both a purely digital as well as a paper-based workflow for this. We do accounting, of course. So whenever we distribute resources to communities and projects within communities, of course, we want to know how these resources are used. and therefore we support accounting such that the sites feed back the accounted, the used resources as accounting data back to FURMS. And of course, we also support notifications about your budget expiring or your budget running low, things like that. And the site integration, of course, causes the, or was the better part of the integration work. So on the lower right here, you see a rather high-level view of the rough FURMS architecture. So on in the lower part, you see the user, which interacts with typically the web interface of FURMS. The initial contact would most of the time be that the user receives an email with an invitation to a project or a community to take on a specific role, either be it an ordinary user or an administrator role at any one of the levels that I mentioned. And then there may be policy. Sorry, I can actually highlight this. There may be policy documents involved that need to be fed back or acknowledged within FURMS. And FURMS communicates as soon as a user with his or her project has been enabled on the site, so to say, communicates via message brokering with the sites over secure connections. I'll go into the details of this later on. So let's take maybe a bit of a step back and see what the stakeholders involved in this architecture actually are. So I've mentioned communities, projects, users, and sites. They are the core either people or groups making up the infrastructure or the environment that we speak about. So a community is something like a virtual organization of scientists entitled to use a given fraction of resources available within the Fenix infrastructure. And from the start, we had a rather fixed split of resource allocations, or the Human Brain Project should receive 25% of the resources. Those are resources as procured from the IC funding, and European researchers at large, which we kind of channeled through PRAISE, should have received 15%. And you'll notice there's a remaining 60% that are delivered or distributed in different ways. So within a community, of which, as you can see, there are only few, there can be projects, which kind of implies that there should be a process of setting up projects that can consume resources within the community. Ideally, that would be a peer review process comparable to what is already used in PRAISE, and that is a process such as those that are typically established at all the participating sites. And there will be a community manager then creating the project, setting up a project manager who in turn can then enable their individual users, so their co-workers or comparable people to collaborate on the project. So a user, like I said, is typically associated with communities and within a community with a project. And there will be privileged users with special permissions, such as administrators of a project, administrators of a community. Naturally, sites also need administrators because the resources that we talked about need to be registered in one way or another. So at each of the 5 initial sites, BSC, CEA, Gineca, CSCS, and Jülich, there will be people in the administrator role registering the available resources for the Fenix infrastructure. And these resources are then split by this fixed ratio that I mentioned for the communities, and made available in this way. So yeah, and once the resources as distributed through the community, trickling down to the projects, and then enabled at each of the local sites, as these resources get used, the usage information gets fed back to FURMS by means of accounting information, such that at each of the levels, so projects and communities, as well as the Fenix Federation, the usage of distributed resources can also be visualized. So this is the, well, general setup. Yeah, status and timeline. I hope the font is not too small. So we started with a call for tender in late 2019, I believe, had to run a second call over the springtime in 2020, and then closed a contract with the successful bidder sometime in August or September, upon which the supplier developing this solution started their first design and detailing phase, which was finalized in November 2020. So we've been going for quite a while now. And then in subsequent phases, starting with phase 2, where release 1.0.0 of FURMS have been released, more and more functionality and aspects of the target solution were implemented until we finalized or received the final version early this year and deployed it. And only then could the site local integration start, which is the second aspect. So like I said, we have this central FURMS component where resources are registered, but we also need a site local agent to translate what is done at the federation level at each of the participating sites. Well, you have to know that the implementations of resource and project management at each of the sites have grown over years, decades, most of the time, and are, you know, somewhat tightly integrated with the sites and different at each of them. There's no single solution across all of these, which there are even good reasons for this, and which might even be the same, which we just now start from the green field. So that's just the way it is. Managing these resources across sites means we need to have a local mapping. So this is what the site local agent does. The implementation of which, because intimate knowledge of the local environment is required in order to be able to do this, each site is responsible to implement their own agent. We requested from the supplier a template agent because of the way we wanted this to be implemented. We requested a template that does rudimentary initial handling of federation level requests to at the local sites, and provided an example of how this could be implemented. The site local agent is actually listening on a message broker. I mentioned when we looked at the architectural overview that we're using message-based communication, which may be something that not everyone is used to. There are reasons for this. I will have them on another slide. And that's why this template agent has been provided. So the status of the site local agent is such that BSC can be considered in production. So whenever you would now enable a project in the Fenix infrastructure at the BSC side, you could go through, or you will go through FURMS. If the same, or the situation is similar for CSCS, and then we have two sites, Chineka and JSC, which are in pre-production, and CEA still in development. So to give you an idea of what is actually required in terms of mapping federation level actions at the local sites, I've listed the 9 aspects that need to be implemented here. So project provisioning and deprovisioning, you could have guessed that. User suspension, so in case at the federation level it becomes known that a user has or a user account has been compromised, then we can actually signal this to the sites and the user can be suspended rather quickly. SSH key provisioning and deprovisioning, like I mentioned before, adding and removing users to and from projects. So there may be various states actually in which a project at a local site may be. It may be coming in for the first time, or it may be already existing and a user gets added, but all these actions need to be reflected at the local site level. Resource allocation naturally must be supported. Granting users access to allocations. This is because not all users have access to all resources within a project, but a project manager has a means to grant access to specific resources in a more fine-grained way. Resource consumption can be, so we support accounting. All this data needs to be fed back to the central FURMS instance. Policy acceptance can be signaled. Ping agent, yeah, of course, one needs to be able to check whether, the basic connection works. The communication, as I said, is done via a message broker. In this case, it's RabbitMQ. There are dedicated queues per site such that there should be or cannot be any interference among the sites. So it is always ensured that site A cannot interfere with the actions or communication of site B. Then the asynchronous communication, that is a natural result of using message-oriented middleware or message-oriented communication patterns. There are reasons for this, because some of the actions that we talk about when registering resources, project setup, all that, trigger potentially long-running operations, which makes it rather inappropriate for the traditional synchronous request response patterns, because if the response takes too long, then asynchronous communication may break or fail in between, and this can be better supported through messaging communication patterns. Communication can be triggered by either party. This is particularly true for the accounting data that may be sent. Polling may be inappropriate because it may be causing unnecessary load without retrieving any new results, but still not guarantee timely propagation of information depending on the polling interval. So that's why we kind of opted for the push-based model that is supported by messaging. So nevertheless, there needs to be some correlation between requests and response independently of how long they actually run. So this is ensured through the message correlation ID that goes along with all interactions between the central FURMS instance and each of the site local agents. There may then be immediate responses or acknowledgements. The acknowledgement may just mean, okay, yeah, I've received the message, but I haven't acted upon it yet. There will be a later message confirming the final result of this action. And versioning of the protocol is also supported. So this communication pattern also allows us to do something like replaying actions. So if we come to know that an action failed for whatever reason, and the site administrators are sure that they want to retrieve or receive the request again, then all unfinished communication exchanges are listed in the user interface for administrative users, of course, only site administrators to be precise. And then one could actually replay, there are several actions, replay, discard, delete these actions. So this is also possible, kind of a nice result and consequence of using message-based communication. All right, let's talk about the deployment that we currently have. We have two separate environments in which we deployed FURMS so far. A staging environment, as we call it, which is there for development, integration, testing, and all kinds of tests and volatile stuff. There's one central instance for all sites, and then later on we learned, well, it doesn't quite serve the purpose for us, because during development, every site every now and then wants to reset their entire environment, with a single environment for all of them at the same time, that would have meant to reset all the site's environments, and therefore we have another instance, an additional one per site and site local agent to support this use case. And like I said, easy to revert baseline states needed to be there to support development. And this is connected to the Fenix AI acceptance environment, which is a parallel authentication and authorization infrastructure for a similar purpose, actually, as we have the staging environment in FURMS. So for testing new features, new setups and configurations. And the second environment that we have, and this will be the one that you'd only ever be interacting with unless you're a developer of a site local integration, is the production environment. So that has, of course, a RabbitMQ with a secure connection, official certificate, limited IP access from only the sites that are relevant here. So there doesn't need to be any communication among external sites and non-participating users with that RabbitMQ. So it's hosted in a highly available VMware cluster at JSC, connected to the production Fenix authentication and authorization infrastructure. It does several daily backups, and the URL currently is firms.fz-jülich.de. It may become firms phoenixri.eu in the future, or supporting both. All right, that's the deployments that we have. User onboarding. So you need to know how to initially or make an initial contact to Fenix. Typically, it will be such that administrator users, be it at the federation, community, or project level, invite users by email, and the users then receive this email and press accept button. If they haven't been registered before in the environment, then they will need to go through a registration process, but then they will be automatically enabled into the role that they've been invited to. Yeah, the general setup of the user interface is such that we have here on the top right a view picker. As you can see, the selected view currently is Fenix admin. As a power user, like I am here for demonstration purposes, you have several sites in which you can be in the admin role. You have several communities and several projects, and for all users, there's user settings, which is also the area where you would, for instance, set up your SSH keys. Then whatever is selected here in the view picker determines what you can see. So the subviews that are available for a Fenix admin, we have a dashboard, a list of sites, a list of communities, an audit log, which may be relevant if some malicious action has been taken and you want to know who took it, or at least in whose name it's been taken place. And you can manage, of course, as a Fenix administrator, you can invite other Fenix administrators and manage the list of them. And depending on the selection in this menu here, that determines then whatever is shown here in the central pane. In this case, it's the dashboard of available resources that can then be distributed to communities. Moreover, here on the top right again, of course, you can log out, but we also have a notification mechanism such that if you are logged in, or if you log in and there are new actions for you to take, such as acknowledging a new site or service policy, or you've been invited to another project or community, then you will be notified about this by this notification area. And then once you go there, it will take you to the notification pane of your user settings, and there you can take action and react to the invitations. So this is the general overview. I will now go through the roles and responsibilities of the users. This is an overview, which I'm gonna skip over because I think all of this information is generally also available on the specific slides, where I also have a screenshot just for to illustrate what things look like. So this is from the user settings view, the SSH key management. So you can add SSH keys to various sites. And as you can already see here, we also have an option for sites to require additional SSH key options if desired. So as some of you may know, there's been a security incident a year and a half ago at several of the European HPC centers. As a consequence of that, we put up some more restrictions regarding SSH key access. And one of these restrictions would be the requirement for a from clause. So from where you can actually use this key, such that it cannot be used from anywhere. And this is also reflected in the FURMS interface. And then once you save this key and you are actually a registered user at the JSC site, otherwise you wouldn't have been able to select this here, then it will trigger an update of your user at the local site and enable your SSH key at the site. So yeah, you can act, like I said, you can act on invitations. You can review your site connection info. As we are looking at or dealing with a federated environment, your local username, for instance, that you have to use for SSH access may differ at each site. So the site connection info provides guidance what to use there. You can look at the projects that you're a member of, the policies that you've acknowledged or need to still acknowledge. SSH keys have been mentioned. You can also create an API key, which is typically really only used for administrator users. Okay, coming to, or speaking of the administrator, we have the Fenix administrator view. This is Fenix administrators, like I said, allocate resources to communities. This can be done either from the dashboard view or from the, sorry, I need to highlight this, dashboard or the communities view. I have an example here of the audit log. So this actually lists all the actions that have been taken in well, recent days, or at the time, at least when I took the screenshot. One can manage additional administrators, like I said. So that's that. A community administrator can do similar actions, but at a different level. So for the community administrator, his or her task is to manage projects and groups, with projects being the primary target here, and allocate resources into the project. So once the Fenix administrator has allocated resources in the community, these resources can then be further split and distributed to the individual projects in the community. So groups are somewhat cross-cutting, as it is sometimes called. So they have no meaning within FURMS, nor any direct mapping at the individual sites, but they can be used for additional services provided at the infrastructure or HPP platform level. The group membership information is exposed via an API that the central Fenix IDP has access to, such that services linked to these could use the information to, for instance, I've created a data curators group, for instance, to allow data curators to act at the community level. But what this actually means depends on the actual service. This is just an example. It was considered a necessary feature when we started the development, but there's no current use case. So groups, project administrators, they can of course do whatever can be done currently at the individual sites, where you typically have access to a project management website or user interface where you can onboard new users to your project, allocate or at least control the service or resource access for the users, kick out users, review the resource consumption. So this can all be done in the project administrator view or in the role of the project administrator. You can request alarms in terms of emails and notifications in the notification area for running low on resources or depending on certain consumption criteria. And at the bottom here, I also showed have a screenshot of what the accounting data would look like when visualized. So this is for the project administrator, but accounting data can be visualized in just the same way also for community and Fenix administrators. So, and site administrators have a somewhat different role as compared to federation, community, and project managers. Site administrators are responsible for defining the resource types available at their sites, defining the services that are linked to resource types, and defining the policy documents. Policy documents also belong to services, checking the site connection, managing other site administrators. So set up and register resource credits, where credits are, the amount of available resources of each of the types that can then be distributed into the community. So there's one other role that we've not touched upon yet, that is site support. So in addition to site administrators, there is a site-specific role with a little more restricted permissions. We thought this would be relevant for the cases where we have a paper-based policy workflow requiring the users to actually put a handwritten signature under their paperwork, hand it in or send it in, and site support staff would then acknowledge this and register, put a tick mark in the user interface of FURMS to let the system know at the technical level that users have their paperwork done. So this is what this role does. All right. Now some examples in terms, I called it flow of events, may or may not be the best term for this, but just some examples of what is taking place in the back end. For instance, when we do resource allocation. So the cycle, you may have guessed it by now, somewhat starts at the top here with a site registering resources, then the resources being distributed at the federation level into communities. The communities then distributed into projects where the resources are then consumed at the sites. So distribution to a community, to a project actually means the project gets enabled at the local site, and then there the resources can be consumed. Accounting data about the consumption is then sent back to FURMS, and yeah, this is how the cycle goes. Or when it comes to user invitations. So at each of the levels that I mentioned before, an administrator can invite users, which typically triggers an email, because this is the way the system interacts with the user when not in the user interface, triggers an email. So these are two snapshots of emails that have been sent around. So the user then responds by following the link. So this accept link actually is a specific link, only valid for a limited amount of time. Following this link, you go through an optional new registration to the FURMS system, and then you take on the role that you've been invited to. And yeah, administrator, just for reasons of completeness, also get notified about this successful invitation and finalization of the invitation process. Project provisioning. So I've mentioned the terms every now and then. I want to be precise and review what a FURMS project actually is and a local project. So in FURMS, the project is the project at the federation level that may or may not have an expression or incarnation at sites. So a project can only have or only gets incarnated at a site when resources of this site have been allocated to a project. And this then makes the local project. So an instance from or of the FURMS project at the local site, and you may have gathered by now, a FURMS project at the federation level can actually have instances at various sites if resources of various sites have been allocated to it. The interactions here regarding FURMS projects and local projects can be of two kinds, essentially. So if site resources are just added to a project that already existed locally at the site, then the site will be notified about this. FURMS knows this in advance, of course. And for the case of an existing local project, the resources are just added. So that's not much. If it is a new local project, then a new local project gets created, the resources get added, and also all the users, of course, that belong to the project need to be added to the local project according to their resource access. One should not forget about that. So as you can see, the interactions between the central FURMS instance and the sites can be complex at some points, and there are many of them, and certain or many side effects needed to be considered here. Yeah. Then one more thing, we have the RESTful API, which can be accessed either through curl. So it's perfectly all right to access the RESTful API through curl or just any simple HTTP client. But there also is a command line interface accessing the CLI, which knows a bit more about FURMS and its inner workings. So you can, for instance, just say FURMS site show, give the site ID. First, before that, I have listed the sites such that I know the ID, and then you get the information about the site. This is rather empty in this example, but anything, sorry, anything beyond that would have busted the slide anyhow. So like I said earlier, you can authenticate through your user ID and API key that you can retrieve from the user interface in the user settings API key tab. And it's predominantly made for administrator access. Okay, so in summary, I've given you an introduction, hopefully, to FURMS, of which you see another architectural diagram here. Gave you insights of the status of development, that we are very close to having 4 sites in production. The meaning and purpose of the site local agent, the deployments that we have. As for end users, only the central instance, for which I have a pointer, another pointer here as well, are relevant. The roles and responsibilities that you may take on, some example workflows of what happens in the back end. If you're interested in more information, we have extensive documentation available under this link. The slides, I can provide the slides after the talk, and you can follow these links, even though they're easy to follow. And with that, I'd be done and would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, Björn, so thank you for your very interesting talk. And now I think it will be great to have a little bit of time for the questions. Anders, can we hear you?
I hope so. I was just curious, you said you had close to 4 sites using the system. Are any sites using it right now, or is this the case for all of the sites that it's close to being used? A bit of background, I'm the project manager of the Nike Puhuri project, doing pretty much the same thing for the Lumi computer?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, that was mentioned rather early. You may have missed it because of that. So the two sites that are in production currently are BSC and CSCS, and Chinica and JSC are somewhat in pre-production. So the development of the site local agent is, yeah, sort of finished, but final tests are still pending. So we're confident that we'll have something in the next weeks.
Thanks for the clarification. Again, I'm sorry I was late to the seminar.
So don't worry, and thanks for joining anyhow. So I can see that there is another question in the question and answers. So what is the approximate number of projects created / processed in FURMS per monthly currently?
That's a tough and an easy one at the same time. So the two sites that are in production have recently gone into this state, and because of the timeline of projects and project applications over time, that's not that much at the moment. I would have loved to see this, you know, under heavy load, but I have to admit, you know, these sites are in production, new projects could be added or existing projects be extended, even though one would have to see how to map the existing ones with the with newly created FURMS ones. Yeah, not that many, Ilya. I'm sorry.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I wanted just to remind everyone, in order to access the Fenix services, we have a set of open and ongoing calls. At the moment, we have two open, the one that is about the HPP and the eBrains call that is always ongoing and it's always open. And the second one is the Praise ICI call that is at the moment open as well. And the deadline is also on the 7th of November. So it's just to bear in mind. Also, it is very important that we really appreciate your feedback. It is important for us to know what are your opinions on these kind of webinars. If you want us to organize any other webinars related to any particular topics, feel free to let us know. And I shared the link already on the chat, so you could fill in the form. It's just with 2 minutes, it's enough. And just to finish our webinar today, I wanted to remind everyone that our next webinar will take place on the 2nd of November. This is the next topic done by Charité from Petra Ritter. Finally, just to finalize and thank everyone for attending this webinar, and of course to our speaker today. You can always stay tuned with us via all those channels that I've included in this slide. And also we have a Fenix user forum that you can also join, and we can then give us your feedback and everything. So thank you very much for everyone, and I hope to see you on the 2nd of November. Thank you.